Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was the old floorboards creaking under the weight of my footsteps. The apartment I lived in was old. Everything creaked, groaned, and cracked at the slightest touch. It was a sound I had grown used to, part of the background noise that kept the place feeling alive, despite its age. But this was different. It started softly, like the familiar squeak of the floor when I shifted my weight in my chair. I was sitting in my small, dimly lit living room, the only light coming from the desk lamp next to my bed, when I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the house settling. But then, there it was again. A soft thud, followed by a quick, sharp tap, then another. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from above or outside. It was coming from below, from the floor beneath me. Thud. Tap. My heart skipped a beat. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps, slow but steady, as if someone was pacing in the room below me. I hadn't heard anyone walk around down there in days. The apartment beneath mine was always quiet. And yet, the sound persisted. I stood up, slowly, as if moving too quickly would somehow make the noise stop, or make it worse. I crept across the room toward the kitchen, where the sound seemed to be most pronounced. I paused at the doorway, my hand resting on the handle of the refrigerator door. For a moment, I thought it had stopped, but then... thud. Tap. It was louder now. More distinct. More alive. I glanced nervously at the floor, the very thing that had always been a part of the apartment, now seeming alien. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural, even. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just the pipes, the house settling again. But then, as I stood there, listening, the sound shifted. It wasn't just a series of taps anymore. It was more rhythmic, almost like the sound of shoes, someone walking deliberately across the floor beneath me. Slow. Measured. Almost like someone was pacing. Thud. Tap. Thud. Tap. I felt my throat tighten. The noise was unmistakable now. It wasn't normal. My eyes flickered toward the living room again, my mind racing. I thought about the building's history, the rumors I'd overheard from the landlord about its past, about strange occurrences in the past tenants' lives, but I had brushed them off at the time. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I was a rational person, after all. But now, with each beat of that strange rhythm, I began to doubt myself. I tried to ignore it. I went back to the couch and sat down, trying to focus on my book, but the sound wouldn't leave. It grew louder, closer, like it was moving directly beneath me. I could hear each tap clearly, now. The precise rhythm of it. It was coming closer, getting nearer to my part of the floor, like whatever was down there was approaching. I stood again, heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. I walked cautiously to the hallway, where the sound seemed to echo more sharply. The old wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, the noise blending with the rhythm below. I reached out, touching the wall for balance. I could feel my breath quickening. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but the sound itself was enough to set every nerve on edge. Thud. Tap. Thud. Tap. It was right beneath me now. I crouched down to the floor, my ear pressed against the wood, the coldness of the floor creeping into my skin. I could feel the vibrations with each step, each tap. It was real. It was undeniable. Something, or someone, was down there. But what? I pulled away, suddenly lightheaded. My pulse was racing in my ears, the sound still pounding through my chest. I looked around the room, my gaze darting over the corners of the apartment, half expecting something to be lurking just out of sight. The footsteps stopped. Silence. The sudden stillness only made the tension in the air worse. My breath seemed too loud in the empty apartment, my heart thumping in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what this was. It felt like something had been triggered, like whatever it was had been waiting for me to notice it. I felt myself moving before I could stop. I backed away from the hallway, my eyes locked on the floor where the sound had been coming from. My mind screamed at me to leave, to grab my things and just go, but my body wouldn't listen. I wasn't going anywhere, not until I figured this out. I grabbed the nearest object, my lamp, and held it like a weapon, ready to strike. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on. The apartment felt too still, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I moved slowly, making my way to the bathroom door at the far end of the hall. The sound had stopped, but I knew it was only a momentary pause. I reached out, my hand trembling as I gripped the doorknob. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned the handle. The door creaked open. Nothing. Just the bathroom, the usual dull flicker of the light. No sound. No movement. But as I stepped inside, I caught a reflection in the mirror that made my blood run cold. Behind me, the floor was moving. There was no mistaking it. A dark, shifting shape was crawling across the wood, spreading out like something alive. The outline of it was indistinct, just a faint blur beneath the surface of the floor. I could hear it now, a scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. And then, a voice. Soft. Faint. Get out. It was the faintest whisper, but I heard it. Clear. I couldn't tell where it had come from, but it was there. I didn't hesitate. I ran for the door, the lamp falling from my grip, crashing to the floor as I darted out of the bathroom and into the living room. The sound of footsteps picked up again, faster now, growing louder as I ran toward the exit. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to get out, now. The door slammed open with a bang, and I bolted into the night air, not stopping until I was safely on the street below, the darkness of the apartment building looming behind me like an insurmountable wall. I don't know what happened in there. I don't know what was beneath that floor or what it wanted. But I do know this. I'll never go back. I stood there in the middle of the street, my breath sharp in my chest, the cold night air stinging my skin. My hands were shaking, my legs unsteady as I tried to process what had just happened. My heart was still pounding, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, more wrong than I could comprehend. I kept looking up at the apartment building behind me, the windows dark and silent. The building looked ordinary now, just another old structure on a quiet street. But I knew it wasn't. I knew something was wrong in there. Something that I couldn't explain, something that had been waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My body was still in fight or flight mode, but I forced myself to turn away from the building. I needed to go home. I needed to calm down and think about this, what I had heard, what I had seen. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something rational. But as I started walking down the street, the city around me felt foreign. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. I felt like I was being watched. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the silence of the night. The noise of the city, usually so familiar, seemed distant, like it wasn't real anymore. Like everything was fading into something other. I shook my head. I needed to get back to some sense of normalcy. As I walked, I replayed everything in my mind, the sound, the footsteps, the whisper. But the more I thought about it, the more my mind raced. How could something have been moving under the floor? What was it? Who or what had made that noise? I couldn't help but wonder if there was something beneath the apartment. Some hidden space, some secret beneath the floorboards that I hadn't seen or noticed before. But that would mean what? Was it a person? A thing? The questions kept spinning, but I forced myself to stop. I didn't want to go down that path. Not yet. I tried to call a friend, anyone, but my phone was dead. Just my luck. I cursed under my breath and pocketed the useless device. I didn't know what I expected anyway, a friendly voice? A rational explanation? What could anyone possibly say to make sense of what had happened? As I approached my apartment building again, the cold feeling that had gripped me earlier returned. The dark windows seemed to watch me as I walked back up the steps. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was waiting, even if I couldn't see it. I stopped at the door for a moment, hesitating. Why am I doing this? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't leave. I couldn't just abandon everything. I had to find out what was going on. I forced the door open, stepping back inside. The silence was heavy, suffocating. It was worse than before, as though the air in the apartment had thickened, pressed in from all sides. My heart raced again as I moved through the living room toward the hallway. The floor creaked beneath my feet, louder than usual. My footsteps felt wrong in the space, echoing too much, too precisely. And then, I heard it. Thud. A soft, almost imperceptible tap, like something being gently set down on the floor. I froze in place, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a sound I had made. It came from beneath me, from somewhere deep inside the apartment. Slowly, I turned toward the hallway, my eyes narrowing as I tried to listen. There it was again. Thud. Tap. The footsteps. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. But the sound wasn't moving anymore. It was waiting. I crept forward, my hands clammy as I reached the hallway, where the noise seemed to be centered. The apartment seemed unnaturally still now, and the deeper I got into the hallway, the more the noise began to shift. At first, it had sounded like slow, deliberate steps, but now it was almost like something was scraping. The sound was becoming jagged, uneven, like nails dragging against the floor. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know what it was. I moved past the door to the bathroom, my gaze flickering over the edge of the floor beneath the doorframe. The floor seemed normal enough. But there was something wrong about it. The way it had moved, the way it had shifted. Thud. It was louder now. The sound was clearer. The pattern of it was becoming more pronounced, like the rhythm of something something waiting. My heart hammered against my chest as I approached the end of the hallway where the floorboards had been at their most active earlier. Then I saw it. The floor beneath the living room rug had bulged. Just a little. Not much, but enough to make the fabric shift, the edges curling upward like something was pushing against it. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and cautiously lifted the edge of the rug. There was something under there. The wood beneath the carpet was cracked, uneven, like something had been pushing its way through for weeks, maybe longer. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the space beneath the floorboards. It wasn't just a space, a gap. It was a hole. A large hole. And there, in the darkness, I could see movement. My hands went cold as I watched the shadow shift again, this time more defined. Not just a shape, but something alive. A figure. Or several figures. Small, barely discernible, moving in the space below me. No. No, no, no. I backed away, the noise rising around me as my panic set in. It was louder now, like a swarm of creatures shifting, crawling. Something was under there. I could hear them now, whispers. Voices. Like faint, indistinct mutterings. But there was no one there. Just the space beneath the floor. The space I hadn't known existed. Then, the tapping began again. Louder, more deliberate. But this time, it was coming closer. And this time, I wasn't sure I was going to make it out. My mind raced, my heart pounded violently against my ribs as I tried to process what was happening. I had to get away. But where? How? There was no escaping the apartment now. No leaving behind whoever was lurking beneath the floor. I backed away from the hole, my hands trembling, until my back hit the wall. I had no plan. No idea what to do next. The whispers, faint and unintelligible, seemed to crawl into my skull, worming their way through my thoughts, scratching at the edges of my sanity. The rhythmic tapping had become more pronounced, louder, each echo feeling like a hammer blow to my nerves. For a moment, everything went still. The shadows beneath the floor stopped moving, the whispers faded, and the tapping ceased. I was paralyzed with fear, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't even bring myself to breathe, as if any movement would break the fragile stillness and bring the terrible noise back. Then, suddenly, the sound returned. Thud. It was close now, too close. I jumped back, my breath ragged, as I looked desperately around the room. What was I supposed to do? My brain screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt as though they were stuck in concrete. I had to make a choice, and it felt like I had no time to think. I needed to act. I turned and ran to the kitchen. The door slammed shut behind me, but the sound of the tapping never ceased. It was as if whatever was beneath the floorboards was following me, moving closer and closer. I grabbed a knife from the drawer, the cold steel trembling in my hand. My breath was shallow, my hands slick with sweat as I stood frozen, listening. The whispers came again, louder now. There was someone speaking beneath me, their words like a distant, frenzied chant. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, hostile, urgent, malevolent. And then I felt it. The floor beneath my feet shuddered, and for a moment it felt like the whole apartment was groaning in agony. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, thick with an unnatural chill that cut through my skin. Thud. It was almost on top of me. I spun around, my back pressing against the counter, the knife raised in front of me like some pathetic form of protection. My thoughts raced in a feverish blur. This was no longer about a sound, no longer about something I could explain. This was something else entirely. Something alive. And it wasn't alone. The tapping was everywhere now. 100 tiny footsteps, scuttling under the floor, creeping up the walls, scratching against the ceiling. The whole room seemed to pulse with it, the vibrations radiating through my bones. The floorboards creaked in time with the growing chorus of movement beneath. Then I heard it, the loudest crack I'd ever heard, followed by a sickening scraping noise. The floor split. It was a small crack at first, just a thin line, but it grew, widening, as if something was pushing its way through the very foundation of the building. My eyes widened as the gap spread, the wood splintering apart, and from within the darkness, a grotesque shape began to emerge. I couldn't even scream. The breath was stolen from my lungs as I stared, wide-eyed, at the figure that slowly pulled itself free from the space under the floorboards. It was impossible to look at it and understand it. Its body was twisted, wrong, made at angles that didn't make sense, limbs that bent in unnatural ways, all encased in the crawling, shifting shadows. It didn't have a face, not a human face, at least. It was just a mass of writhing, black tendrils, something that barely resembled anything living, yet somehow pulsed with a life of its own. The whispers grew louder as its tendrils reached the floor, slithering across the wood like they were searching for something or someone. The thing was coming for me. And it wasn't alone. A second, smaller form pushed its way through the gap, then another. And another. There were more. They were everywhere, creeping from the cracks in the floor, emerging like cockroaches from some hellish abyss. The room was filled with them now, bodies, limbs, shadows, crawling in every direction. The noise was unbearable, a combination of scratching, whispering, clicking sounds that made my skin crawl. I backed into the far corner, my grip on the knife weakening as the overwhelming terror paralyzed me. I had no idea what these things were, but I could feel them closing in on me. The air was thick with their presence, like they were suffocating me. I had to get out. I stumbled toward the door, the knife still clutched in my shaking hand, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. The whispering had stopped. The tapping was gone. For a moment, everything was eerily silent. And then, just as I was about to turn the handle, a voice, clear and cold, echoed from beneath the floor. Leave. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a scream. It was a command. And I knew, deep in my bones, that if I didn't leave now, I wouldn't survive the night. The tapping was louder now. It was like something was scratching its way up from the floorboards, getting closer, no longer hiding in the shadows beneath the wood. I could feel the air shift around me, thick and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. My hands were clammy, and my breath came in shallow, quick bursts. I could barely focus, my mind racing for an explanation, but there was nothing logical I could cling to. I took a step back, my body moving on its own as my brain screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't. The sound was drawing me in, like some terrible force I couldn't escape. It felt like the floor beneath me had a pulse, thumping rhythmically, alive. My eyes flickered to the hole in the floor again, the small gap where the wood had splintered and shifted. And then, I saw it, movement. At first, it was barely noticeable. A flicker in the dark, something small and almost imperceptible. But then it grew. I took a step forward, my feet barely making a sound on the creaky floor. My hand, now shaking uncontrollably, reached for the edge of the floorboard. I didn't know why. Maybe I was hoping to stop it, to understand it, to see it clearly. But the moment my fingers brushed against the wood, the sound stopped. Dead silence. I froze. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, eyes darting around the room. My senses felt heightened, alert to every detail, every shift of the air. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, willing the silence to break. Then, bang. The floorboard beneath my fingers cracked, splitting wide open, the sound sharp and loud, like a gunshot in the stillness. My heart leapt in my chest, and I stumbled back, my legs failing me for a moment as I collapsed onto the couch. A figure moved out from the dark, just a shape at first, crawling out from the gap in the floor like something unnatural. It was low to the ground, skittering like an animal, but far too fast. The outline was too vague to make out clearly, but the movements were unmistakable, like a person, but twisted. It dragged itself forward, inching its way up, and I could hear the scraping of its body against the wood. My stomach twisted, nausea creeping up on me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away. The thing, whatever it was, had elongated limbs. Too long. Too thin. The way it moved reminded me of the insects I used to watch when I was a kid, how they'd scurry, their legs making sharp, rapid movements. But this was not an insect. The whispers started again. Faint at first, just a soft muttering, like a low chant or a conversation I couldn't quite hear. The voice, or voices, sounded familiar, but there was something wrong with them. Hollow. Empty. They made no sense, like they were coming from deep beneath the earth. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise as the thing crept closer, its shape becoming clearer, but still impossible to fully make out. It had a face. Or maybe it was a face, but it was wrong. The features were stretched, pulled in unnatural directions. Its eyes were too large, too vacant, like black holes that stared back at me, absorbing everything around them. I gasped, unable to stop myself, and that noise, the noise of my breath, the sound of my panic, seemed to startle it. The figure stopped moving, and in that silence, I could hear the faintest sound of breathing. Not mine. It was coming from the floor. From where it lay. I wanted to scream. To run. To do anything but stay here. But I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in terror. The figure's face shifted. It didn't smile, but I could feel it. There was something sickening about it, like it knew what I was thinking. Like it had been waiting for this moment. For me. I couldn't breathe. My vision started to blur at the edges, the walls around me closing in as I struggled to remain grounded, to stay sane. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out the whispers. I fought to stay conscious, to stay in control, but the longer I looked at the thing, the more I felt my mind slipping away. Then, it moved again. Slowly, deliberately. It shifted itself, pushing itself up from the floor as if it was testing the space, as if it was getting ready to rise fully. But it didn't move toward me. Instead, it crawled toward the door. I could feel a sense of dread build within me, a strange premonition that it wasn't just here, but it was going somewhere. Somewhere I didn't want it to go. The tapping began again, rhythmic and slow. Not from the floor this time, but from the direction of the hallway, closer. I turned and saw the shadows in the hallway, stretching unnaturally long, like they were reaching. It's coming toward me. My legs finally gave out, and I crashed to the floor, my breath ragged as I tried to make sense of what was happening. What had been happening? The whispers were growing louder. I heard them clearer now, echoing from the hallway, mixing with the noise in my head. The air was thick with a strange energy, like something was about to snap. The shadows were pressing in. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave. I scrambled to my feet, but before I could take a step, the door to my apartment slammed shut with a deafening force. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed through the room. I wasn't alone anymore. I froze, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The door was shut, locked. I could feel the sudden shift in the air, as if the very atmosphere had thickened, become heavier. My heartbeat quickened, and for the first time, I realized how trapped I was. I had no escape. No way out. I stumbled backward, my eyes frantically scanning the room. The thing from the floor, it had stopped moving. For a split second, I thought it might have vanished, that perhaps I had imagined everything. But then I heard it. That low, sickening sound again. The scraping of bone on wood. It was still here. It was closer now. I couldn't tell where exactly, but it was moving, always moving. The whispers had returned too, louder this time. They were no longer faint echoes from the floor, they were all around me. Everywhere. Above me. Behind me. Under me. Like the walls themselves were breathing. My breath was shallow, my hands slick with sweat. I was shaking, but I had no control over it. Every instinct told me to scream, to run. But I couldn't. Something was holding me here. Something was keeping me still, frozen, as if the very air in the room had turned to cement. I glanced back at the door, desperate to escape, but it remained solid, unyielding. My mind screamed for me to try, to do something, but nothing in the room offered hope. The walls were closing in. The room had shrunk, I was certain of it. The space that had felt so familiar was now suffocating. And then, just when I thought I might collapse, the whispering stopped. The room fell dead silent. My eyes darted to the floor where I had last seen the figure. It was gone. My body tensed, every fiber of my being screaming that something worse was about to happen. The longer I stared at the floor, the more I began to feel it, presence. It wasn't just the thing on the floor. No, this presence was larger, more encompassing. It was coming from the very walls, the ceiling. It was inside the apartment with me. My thoughts were racing. I was caught in a whirlwind of panic and confusion. There was no way I could explain this. No one would believe me. I needed to get out. There had to be another way out. I moved toward the window, heart hammering in my chest. I glanced at the door once more, but it was still sealed. The lock twisted, but it wouldn't budge. Not from my side. I reached the window, but when I pulled it open, all I saw was darkness. The night outside had swallowed everything. There was no sky. No stars. Only blackness that seemed to stretch infinitely, as though the world had disappeared entirely. The whispers came back, louder now, mixing with something else, footsteps. My legs froze, rooted to the spot. I wasn't imagining it. The sound of someone, or something, was walking down the hall. The rhythmic pattern. The unmistakable pace of footsteps moving slowly, deliberately, like they were measuring the distance between us. I turned, my back to the window now, and my mind raced. It was coming closer. I couldn't wait. I couldn't just stand here and listen. The thing in the floor had returned, and it was moving again, skittering along the wood with an unnatural speed. I turned, almost without thinking, and bolted for the kitchen door, heart in my throat. The kitchen was dark. The shadows stretched impossibly far across the floor, but I didn't have time to care. I shoved open the door to the hallway and almost collided with the wall, my mind clouded by panic. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape. The footsteps were still coming, growing louder, closer. They were behind me now. I could feel them pressing against my back, like a weight, like they were chasing me, closing in on me from all sides. The walls felt too tight, too narrow. The air itself seemed to turn stale, suffocating. I had to get out. I couldn't breathe. I ran faster, but then, bang! A loud, heavy thud from behind me. The sound of something falling. Something crashing into the ground, the way a body would fall, limp and lifeless. I stopped. I turned, my body frozen, unable to make a sound, my heart in my throat. At the end of the hallway, the thing from the floor was standing. Not crawling. Not skittering. Standing upright. Its long limbs were bent at unnatural angles, its head turned toward me with an impossible angle. Its eyes, those hollow, endless pits, were locked on me. And then, as if it could read my thoughts, it moved. Not toward me. It turned around, slowly, deliberately, and walked away. Each step was a hollow echo in the silence, like it was mocking me. Like it knew I was paralyzed with fear. The whispers were deafening now. There was no escape. No one was coming. The only thing I could hear, feel, was the thing that had taken over this place. I backed away from it, my hands reaching behind me, searching for the wall to steady myself. I couldn't stop myself from looking. I couldn't stop myself from watching it disappear into the darkness, down the hallway, into the very walls I had tried to escape. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen. It's in the walls now. And I realized something then. This wasn't just some random haunting. This wasn't just some twisted creature from beneath the floor. This was something older. Something that had always been here, under my feet, waiting for me. And now, it had me. I don't know how long I stood there in the hallway, the weight of my own breath pounding in my ears. It felt as if time itself had stopped. The air was thick, suffocating, like every particle was pressing against me, urging me to remain still, to not make a sound. But I couldn't stop myself. My feet, trembling uncontrollably, took a hesitant step forward. And then another. I was moving, but not because I wanted to. It was as if something invisible had a hold of me, pulling me toward the darkness at the end of the hallway, where the thing had disappeared. The thing. I still couldn't process what it was. It was no longer human, if it ever had been. Its movements, its eyes, its presence, everything about it was wrong. I wiped my palms against my jeans, trying to steady myself, but the sweat only made my skin slicker, more vulnerable. My mouth was dry, but the taste of fear was the only thing I could taste now. It was in the walls. In the very structure of the apartment. And I knew with a terrible certainty that it was never going to leave. A sound, distant at first, like the scratching of claws, came from the wall in front of me. My head snapped up, but there was nothing. Just the wall. Just the silence. but I could feel it. The pressure of something being there, just behind the plaster, just below the surface. I reached for my phone, hands shaking, and tried to dial. The screen blinked for a moment before flashing something I didn't understand, garbled letters, random numbers. The connection was dead. Of course. It had to be. No one would hear me. No one would believe me. I was completely alone. Alone. I thought of the neighbors. They had to be able to hear the noises too. But when I had tried to talk to them before, they always dismissed it. Told me I was imagining things. Said the building was old, the pipes must be noisy, that I was just stressed. But this wasn't stress. This wasn't an overactive imagination. I stepped toward the door to my bedroom, hesitant. I knew I shouldn't go back in there, but it felt like the only place that could give me some sort of comfort, if comfort was even possible anymore. If I could just find some logical explanation. If I could just find something to hold on to. As I passed the threshold into the room, I saw it. The floor was different. I don't mean that the wood was warped or cracked, or that the floorboards were shifted. No. This was something else. There were faint indentations, grooves in the floor, like something had been crawling through the wood. Something small. Something deliberate. My eyes tracked them, following the subtle path as it led deeper into the room. A chill ran down my spine. The markings were too symmetrical, too precise to be random. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my throat. That's when I saw it, beneath the floorboards, just barely visible through the small gaps, there was a faint glow. A low, unnatural light emanated from underneath, pulsating like the faintest heartbeat. The color was something that shouldn't have been there, something wrong, like oil and water, swirling and shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible. It was like the floor itself was breathing. The breath caught in my chest as I crouched down to inspect it more closely, my fingertips just grazing the edges of the boards. The instant my fingers made contact with the wood, the room seemed to shift. The air thickened once more, and the glow below the floor intensified, now a harsh, pulsing light that made the shadows twist in unnatural directions. I jerked my hand back, instinctively, as the floor under my feet seemed to shift with it. The hum grew louder. The scratching started again, this time from beneath the floor, louder, more insistent. It was almost like a voice. A low, guttural murmur, muffled by the wood, but unmistakable. It was speaking to me. I pressed my palms against the sides of my head, desperately trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, they were all vibrating with it now, with that terrible hum. The scratching grew into something more recognizable. Footsteps. Human footsteps. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. And then it stopped. I opened my eyes. The room was still. The only sound now was my own shallow breathing. For a moment, I thought maybe it had ended. Maybe I could breathe, finally. But then I heard it again, the sound of something moving inside the walls. The scratches. The thuds. And, this time, something else, something worse. A voice. It wasn't coming from the floor anymore. It was coming from behind me. From the shadows in the corner of the room where I had never looked. The voice was a whisper, soft at first, but unmistakable. You're not alone. My heart stopped. I turned, but there was no one. The room remained empty. The voice had come from the darkness, from the corners, but it was unmistakable. I wasn't alone. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the apartment that was haunted. It was me. It had always been me. I had been the one it had been waiting for. And now, it was coming for me. It started with a simple question. Am I being watched? I had noticed it for a while now, but never quite acknowledged it. People standing on the street, staring. Not moving, not speaking. Just watching. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Maybe they were waiting for someone, or lost in their own thoughts. But then it happened again, and again. Every time I left my apartment, they were there. Always in the corner of my eye, always just a little too still. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but now it felt like an inevitable presence. Every corner I turned, every street I crossed, their eyes were there. Like something, or someone, was following me, observing me from a distance. I live in a small, familiar town, one where nothing ever seems out of place. The people here know each other, smile at each other. It's the kind of place where nothing strange happens, or so I thought. I remember that afternoon like it was yesterday. It was a Wednesday, just after the lunch rush. The street was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. The sound of the wind brushing against the pavement was almost deafening, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I was walking toward the park, just a short stroll to clear my head. That's when I saw her. She stood near a street lamp, her gaze fixed directly on me. She wasn't moving. Her clothes were nothing out of the ordinary, just a dark coat and jeans, but it was her eyes that bothered me. The intensity of her stare. It was like she could see straight through me. I quickened my pace, shaking the feeling off. It wasn't like I hadn't seen people standing still before. Maybe she was waiting for someone, I thought. But the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. Something was off. I tried not to look back, but the urge was unbearable. When I did, she was gone. Just vanished. As if she had never been there at all. No trace, not even the faintest sound of footsteps. I stopped in my tracks. My heart skipped. The air around me felt thicker, heavier. My skin prickled with unease. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling lingered. I glanced around, but all I saw were people walking past, lost in their own worlds. Was I imagining things? I must have been. After all, people don't just disappear like that. Do they? But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of her face. The eyes. The way they locked on mine. Was it real? Or had it all been in my head? The next day, I thought it was over. I would forget about it, move on. But as I walked down the same street again, I saw another figure. This time, it was a man. He stood motionless at the end of the alleyway, staring directly at me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My pulse quickened. Again, I didn't look away. I forced myself to turn, to keep walking. I couldn't let him see how afraid I was. I turned the corner, but when I glanced back, he was gone, as if he'd never been there. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Was it just my mind playing tricks? Or was something more sinister happening? As the days passed, the watchers became more frequent. I'd spot them on sidewalks, across the street, in doorways, their eyes always fixed on me, unmoving. Their faces were often blank, expressionless, but the intensity of their gaze made my skin crawl. And then came the sounds. At night, while I lay in bed, I could hear something faintly, like footsteps, just beyond my window. Soft, hesitant steps, moving closer and closer. I knew it couldn't be the wind or a passing car. The sound was too deliberate, too close. But when I pulled back the curtain and looked out into the street, there was nothing. No one. Just the stillness of the night. It happened again and again. I could never quite catch the person, but I felt them there, lurking just outside my vision. Always just out of reach. And the worst part? It wasn't just in the street. I began noticing them in the shops, on the bus, in the grocery store. I couldn't escape it. I was being watched. There was no doubt about it anymore. The question nagged at me constantly. Why me? What did they want? And most terrifying of all, why had they started appearing only now? I tried to ignore the growing dread, convincing myself it was nothing more than paranoia, but the truth was undeniable. I was being followed. I was being watched. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized one terrifying truth: these weren't just random strangers. These people were waiting for something. They were waiting for me. It wasn't until the next week that the fear really began to settle in. The watchers had always been there, lurking in the background, but now they felt closer. I couldn't shake the sensation that they were everywhere I went, always just a little too still, their eyes piercing through me like 1,000 needles. I decided to do something I hadn't dared to try before. I was going to confront one of them. It was a Thursday afternoon when I saw him again, the man I had spotted a few days ago. He was standing on the same corner, but this time his presence felt different. There was something more menacing about the way he was positioned, like he was waiting for me to notice him. His dark coat blended perfectly with the shadows, but I could still see his pale face staring, unwavering, directly at me. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat as my feet felt glued to the pavement. I hadn't planned to approach him, but my legs moved against my will, pulling me closer. It was like some invisible force was guiding me. As I got closer, I saw the details more clearly. His face, his eyes, were completely blank, like lifeless voids staring into nothingness. There was no expression, no emotion in his face. Just that unblinking gaze. The air grew thicker around me, heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but my voice caught in my throat. "Excuse me, are you all right?" I managed to whisper, my words barely escaping my lips. He didn't answer. He didn't even move. Just stood there, staring. And then, like a switch had been flipped, I felt something change. The world around me seemed to warp for a moment, the edges of reality blurring. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, he was gone. No sign of him. No footsteps, no rustling of clothing. Just an empty corner. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with panic. I looked around wildly, my vision spinning, but there was no trace of him, just the usual crowd walking past, oblivious to anything unusual. But something told me this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Over the next few days, the watchers began to multiply. The streets, which had once felt so safe, now felt like a maze. Everywhere I turned, there they were, always standing, always watching. Some of them were in the distance, hidden behind street signs or parked cars, but I could still feel their eyes on me. Others were right in front of me, just standing there in the middle of the sidewalk, blocking my path. I started to avoid the streets I knew best, taking longer, unfamiliar routes just to get from one place to another. But it didn't matter. The watchers were everywhere. Every corner I turned, every street I crossed, they were waiting for me. And it wasn't just in the daytime anymore. At night, I'd wake to the sound of soft, almost imperceptible footsteps just outside my window. The sound was so faint, it was like the person was trying not to be heard, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Slow. Deliberate. I'd rush to the window, pull back the curtain, and peer into the darkness. But again, nothing. No one. Just the empty street, bathed in the dim light of the lampposts. But it wasn't just the streets. It was my apartment too. The feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. At first, it was just the sensation of eyes on me, lingering in the corners of the room. But then, it got worse. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint knock. I froze. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was there. A soft, rhythmic knock on the front door. I got up slowly, my heart pounding. I was careful not to make a sound as I approached the door. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway. Confused, I opened the door, but again, no one was in sight. There was nothing but the silence of the hallway stretching in both directions. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier. My skin crawled. And as I stepped back inside, something caught my eye, a small piece of paper lying on the floor. I bent down to pick it up. There was no writing on it, just a single black mark in the shape of an eye. I shuddered as I held it in my hand. It wasn't just the paper. It was the feeling, the sense that something was waiting for me. Watching. Always watching. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't deny what was happening. The watchers were real, and they were getting closer. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I understood about them. Who were they? Why were they watching me? And the most chilling question of all, what did they want? That night, I decided to confront the feeling once and for all. I couldn't let this continue, couldn't keep living in fear of things I couldn't explain. I stood in front of the window, staring out into the street. The wind howled softly, and the shadows of the trees danced in the light of the street lamps. And then I saw it. In the distance, standing under the light of a lamppost, was a figure. A woman, just like the one I'd seen the first time. She stood perfectly still, as though waiting for me to notice her. Her face was obscured in shadow, but I could see the shape of her, the outline of her body, the unnatural stillness of her posture. And for the first time, I didn't feel just fear. I felt a strange sense of recognition, like I knew her or knew something about her. I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't look away. I took a step closer to the window, my breath shallow. But as I leaned in to get a better look, a cold gust of wind slammed the window shut, rattling the glass. I jumped back, heart racing. When I looked out again, she was gone. It was impossible to ignore it anymore. The watchers were not just following me, they were everywhere. Each day felt heavier than the last, as though I was carrying the weight of their eyes on my back, constantly aware that someone was observing my every move. The nights were the worst. The cold silence, the weight in the air, the footsteps outside my window that never seemed to stop. It wasn't just that they were there, it was that they weren't supposed to be. This town, this street, had always been calm, peaceful. No one ever paid attention to you, at least not like this. But now it felt like everything was upside down. The more I thought about it, the more I began to understand the creeping terror that came with them. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched, it was the knowledge that they had no real purpose. There was no explanation for them, no logic. Just a silent, unnerving presence that watched, waited, and never left. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. The idea that I might be going crazy, that these strange occurrences were merely a product of my mind, wasn't enough to calm my rising panic. I had to find out what was happening. I had to confront them. I started by retracing my steps, going back to the places where I'd seen them. The street lamp where the woman had stood, the alley where the man had disappeared. Maybe there was something in the environment that was causing these hallucinations. Maybe something in the air, the light, the shadows, was playing tricks on me. The evening air was colder than usual as I walked down the familiar street, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. The town felt unusually empty, as if everyone had suddenly decided to vanish. Not a single car passed. No one on the sidewalks. The silence was so oppressive that I could hear the rustle of my own coat as I moved. And then, I saw him. The man from before. He was standing across the street, his back turned to me, almost as if he knew I was coming. The way he stood, so rigid, so unmoving, felt like an unnatural stillness. It wasn't like he was waiting for someone, it was like he was waiting for me. This time, something in me snapped. I had to know what he wanted. What was this all about? I crossed the street, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of dread became. It was like I was walking into a trap, and I was too far gone to turn back now. My fingers trembled as I took one more step, just a few feet away from him. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him who he was, why he was there, but the words stuck in my throat. His head slowly turned toward me, and I could see his eyes now. But they weren't like eyes at all. They were dark, like black pools of ink, sucking the light around them. His face remained expressionless, but there was something about the way he looked at me. He wasn't just observing me. He was studying me. And then, with a soft sound that I can only describe as a whisper of wind, he stepped forward. No sound of footsteps. No movement of his body. He was just there, closer than I expected, towering over me in the blink of an eye. I froze. His mouth opened slowly, a strange, unsettling smile creeping across his face. But it wasn't a smile of warmth or even malice. It was something else, something more horrifying, like a smile meant to show that he knew something I didn't. "You're not alone," he whispered, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. I took a step back, my legs shaking. What did that mean? You're not alone? I didn't have time to think about it because in that instant, his form seemed to shift. The air around him warped. His edges blurred, like I was seeing him through a fogged window. And then, he was gone. I stumbled backward, unable to believe what had just happened. I looked around frantically. No one. Just the empty street, the wind picking up, the silence swallowing the moment. But the words "you're not alone" lingered in my mind like a curse, repeating in my head. What was that supposed to mean? Was he part of this strange force? Was he another watcher? I didn't sleep that night. The anxiety churned in my stomach, and my mind raced with thoughts of what I had just experienced. The streets felt more like a labyrinth now, like there was something hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to step too far. As dawn broke, I decided to return to the place where it all began, the park. The first time I had noticed something was wrong. The first time I saw one of them standing, motionless, watching. Maybe if I returned to the source, I could find some clue, some explanation. The park was eerily quiet when I arrived. The usual rustle of leaves, the sound of children laughing, everything that made it feel like a normal park, was absent. The place was empty, not a soul in sight. The grass had an unnatural stillness to it, as if even nature had been frozen by something unseen. I walked through the park slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then, just as I rounded a corner, I saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the edge of the path, near the old bench by the fountain. She was facing away from me, but I could tell she knew I was there. The air grew heavier, and I could almost feel the weight of her gaze, even though she wasn't looking at me. I approached cautiously, but the moment I stepped closer, she turned. Her face was obscured by a hood, but I could still see her eyes. And once again, they were the same dark, empty pools that seemed to swallow any light they touched. "You don't understand yet," she said softly, her voice like the wind itself, barely audible. "But you will." Before I could respond, she stepped backward, disappearing into the trees, blending in with the shadows like she had never been there. The words she spoke echoed in my mind. "You don't understand yet." What was there to understand? What was happening to me? I stood frozen, looking at the empty spot where she had been, my mind spiraling further into confusion and fear. The watchers weren't just following me anymore. They were trying to communicate. But what did they want? And why did they choose me? The answers were just beyond reach, hidden in the shadows where they watched and waited. I didn't return to the park for days. After the woman disappeared into the shadows, her words repeated over and over in my head. "You don't understand yet." What did she mean by that? What was I missing? Every time I tried to make sense of it, 1,000 different possibilities flooded my mind, each more terrifying than the last. I had to find out more. I couldn't live in fear of the unknown anymore. The following week, I decided to gather whatever courage I had left and confront the one place I had avoided, my apartment. It had become a sanctuary of dread, filled with the memories of all the unsettling events that had transpired. The quiet whispers at night, the faint knocks on the door, the shadows in the corners of my vision. I had tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew the truth, something was wrong, and it was waiting for me. I went through my daily routine, forcing myself to ignore the unease that crept up whenever I walked past my door. The air outside felt oddly charged, the kind of static electricity that pricks at the skin. But there was no one watching me this time. No watchers lurking in the corners. For the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of calm. When I stepped inside, it felt like I was walking into a different world. The usual hum of my refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, all seemed distant, muffled. The apartment was still, eerily still, as though it was holding its breath. But it didn't last long. As I passed by the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of something, just a flash of movement in the reflection. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. The mirror, however, was different. It was fogged, as if someone had breathed on it. Slowly, I approached it, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. I reached out to wipe it away, but the moment my fingers touched the surface, I felt a cold, sharp jolt of fear shoot through me. It was like the mirror had shifted, bending the air around it. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the apartment, light and deliberate. They were coming from behind me. No, wait, there was no one there. I turned and ran to the living room, my eyes scanning the room. But everything was exactly where I had left it. There were no shadows shifting, no movement in the corners of my vision. Yet the air was thick with something, an invisible presence, an unshakable feeling that someone, or something, was watching. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The watchers had to be real. But where were they now? Where had they gone? That night, I decided to stay awake. I had to see if they would return. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I needed answers. The flickering streetlight outside my window cast long shadows across the room, and I sat in the dark, staring at the wall, listening. The hours passed in silence. The city outside my window was quiet, unnaturally so. No cars. No footsteps. Just the stillness. I thought I saw something, just a movement in the corner of the room. A figure, standing there. I blinked, and it was gone. But I could still feel it, the pressure, the weight of its presence. I stood up, my body tense, and walked cautiously toward the living room. As I passed the window, I noticed the figure again, this time standing outside in the street, just beneath the light. It was a man. Tall, thin, with dark hair and a long coat that seemed to blend with the shadows. His face was partially obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me. I was certain of it. I opened the window, the cold night air biting at my skin. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" But the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring. I felt my breath catch in my throat as he slowly raised his hand, pointing directly at me. It wasn't a gesture of warning. It was a command. "Come," he whispered. The voice was faint, almost lost in the wind. "Come to us." My blood ran cold. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just some random person. This was one of them. One of the watchers. And they were inviting me. I couldn't resist. There was something irresistible about the command, something that pulled at my very soul. I felt my body move as if guided by an unseen force. I stepped away from the window and grabbed my coat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I knew I should run. I should lock the door and never look back. But my legs carried me forward, out the door into the street. The street lamps flickered above me, casting long shadows on the pavement. The chill in the air cut through my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The man was still there, waiting under the light. And as I walked toward him, I felt the presence of others, more than one. There were figures in the distance, standing at the edges of the street, watching silently. They were like silhouettes, barely distinguishable from the darkness, but I knew they were there. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, as if I was sinking into the earth itself. The distance between me and the man seemed to stretch, but somehow I was closer than ever. His face was now fully visible, though still shrouded in an unnatural darkness. His eyes were black, empty, and yet they seemed to pierce into my soul. He didn't speak again, but as I approached, I could feel the pull. It was like gravity, something unexplainable, but undeniable. The others moved too, slowly, silently. There was no escape. "Come to us," the man repeated, his voice distant but clear, as if it were coming from all directions. And just before I reached him, the world seemed to collapse. The streetlights flickered and went out, the air thickened, and the figures around me began to shift, their forms blurring. I looked up at the sky, and the stars were gone. Everything around me was swallowed by an overwhelming darkness, as if the entire world was being consumed. I reached out to him, my hand trembling, but just as my fingers brushed against his cold skin, I woke up. I was back in my apartment, lying on the couch, my heart hammering in my chest. Sweat soaked my clothes, my breath ragged. My hands trembled as I sat up. It was all gone, the darkness, the watchers, the feeling of being pulled toward them. The apartment was quiet. Still. But the feeling hadn't left me. The words echoed in my mind, louder than ever, "Come to us." And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before they came for me again. I wasn't sure how long it had been since I woke up. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't seem to exist anymore. My body felt like it had been through a war, yet I couldn't remember fighting. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't stay here. Not in this apartment. Not with the feeling of them lingering. The air was thick, the silence too loud, and my mind was unraveling. It was hard to tell what was real and what was part of the nightmare that kept creeping up on me. The events of the night, the man, the shadows, the invitation felt so vivid, but the apartment looked the same as it had before. Too normal. Too familiar. Yet, there was an unshakable certainty growing inside me. They were real. And they were waiting. I stumbled out of the apartment, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking as I gripped the keys. I didn't know where to go, what to do. I couldn't trust my own mind, but I couldn't ignore the pull either. I had to find them. I had to know what they wanted. The streets outside were still. Too still. The city was suffocating under the quiet, and I felt like I was walking through a dream, everything distant, everything just a little off. The same figures I had seen before, those watchers, now felt like a part of the city, a shadow I couldn't escape. They were everywhere. I moved faster, my pace picking up as the pressure in my chest intensified. I turned down a narrow alley, one that led toward the old park, the place where it had all started. My footsteps echoed off the walls, but no sound seemed to come back to me. It was as if I was moving in a vacuum. The park was ahead, just on the other side of the alley. It was darker than I remembered, the trees stretching out like skeletal fingers, their branches blocking the few rays of light that managed to pierce the thick night sky. I could feel them, the watchers, surrounding me, their presence growing heavier the closer I got to the park. And there, standing at the entrance, was the man again. The one who had invited me. His face was still the same, hollow eyes, dark, like endless voids that swallowed all light. "You came," he whispered, his voice floating through the air like smoke. "We knew you would." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But something in me knew this was it. The moment I had been avoiding. The moment when everything would come to an end. "You've been watching me," I said, my voice trembling. "Why?" His lips curved into that unsettling smile. "Not just you," he murmured, stepping forward. His eyes never left mine, the void in them pulling me closer. "We've been watching all of you." I backed up, panic clawing at my throat. There was no way out, no way to escape the growing dread that pressed in from all sides. The others, they were still here, hidden in the shadows. I could feel them, feel their eyes boring into me. Every corner seemed to twist into something darker, something I couldn't quite grasp. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. "What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head, as if considering the question before he spoke again, his voice like ice. We are the watchers, the silent observers. And you are the chosen one. I felt the ground beneath me shift, the air growing colder. His words didn't make sense, but I couldn't deny the feeling something was happening. Something beyond explanation. Chosen? I echoed, struggling to hold onto my sanity. What do you mean? You were always meant to be here, he said, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming. This town, this place, it's all part of the cycle. We've been waiting for you to understand. Suddenly, a sharp, screeching noise ripped through the air, like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The shadows around me started to pulse, to shift, growing, morphing into something else, something terrifying. Figures emerged from the darkness, their shapes flickering like shadows in the night. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel them. They were here. The Watchers weren't just a few strange figures anymore. They were everywhere, closing in. The trees in the park began to twist, their limbs moving, their roots breaking through the ground like living things, their bark shifting into faces, eyes watching, silent, waiting. The man smiled again, his grin widening in a way that felt unnatural. You've reached the end. This is where the cycle begins again. My mind raced. Cycle? Was this a curse? A ritual? Or something far worse? The shadows around me began to close in tighter, and I knew that if I didn't do something now, I would be consumed by them. I ran, my feet pounding the dirt path, my breath ragged, my heart racing. But no matter how fast I moved, the figures kept pace, the shadows just inches behind me, always watching, always following. I had to get away. I had to escape. But the more I ran, the more the world around me warped. The sky twisted into an unnatural black, the stars flickering and disappearing. The ground itself seemed to ripple like water, the path I had been running down now a shifting maze. I was trapped in a world where nothing made sense, and the only thing that was certain was that I was not alone. And then, just as I reached the edge of the park, I heard it again. A voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the madness. You cannot escape. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. The figure of the man stood before me, his eyes locked onto mine. You're one of us now, he said, his voice like the wind, like the darkness itself. There's no going back. I felt it then, the pull. The draw. The Watchers were not just observing me. They had taken me. I was one of them now. The cycle had begun, and I was trapped in it, forever a part of the darkness. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And then, everything went black. The silence returned. But I knew, deep down, that the Watchers were still there, still waiting, still watching. And I would never be free. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I always thought the stories people told, ghosts, curses, strange occurrences, were just overactive imaginations running wild. That was until I stepped into Victor's apartment. It was a simple place, nothing fancy. The kind of apartment you might expect a bachelor to have. One bedroom, dimly lit, with the faint scent of coffee always lingering in the air. But there was something off about it that day. A feeling I couldn't shake. We were standing in his living room, chatting about random things. The conversation flowed easily between us, but I couldn't ignore the strange pull I felt towards the far corner of the room. There, Behind a bookshelf that seemed just a little too heavy to move was a door I'd never noticed before. I asked Victor about it, trying to keep the tone casual. "Hey, what's behind that door?" His response was nonchalant, almost too quick. "Oh, it's just a room. I don't like to have people in there." I laughed, thinking it was some sort of quirky thing, maybe a storage room or a place he kept his personal stuff. But the way he said it, it didn't sit right with me. Like he was trying to brush something off, something I wasn't supposed to see. "Well, I won't bother it, I guess," I said, trying to ease the awkward tension I suddenly felt. He cut me off. "Don't go in there. Seriously." That's when it hit me. The air in the room had shifted, like the very walls were pressing in, urging me to ignore that door and focus on anything else. But the more I tried not to think about it, the more it gnawed at me. Later that evening, after a few beers, I found myself alone in the living room while Victor went to answer a phone call. The door in the corner stared at me from across the room as if it had its own consciousness. The faint sound of rustling, like the soft shuffle of footsteps, came from behind it. At first, I thought it was just the old apartment settling. But then I heard it again. And again. Closer this time. My heartbeat quickened. I stood up and walked toward the door. My feet felt heavier with each step, as if the very air had thickened. I reached the bookshelf, my hand resting on the wood. The rustling noise was now louder, almost like whispers. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could think twice, I grabbed the corner of the bookshelf and pulled. It didn't budge. I yanked harder, my muscles straining. Nothing. I could hear the whispers now, clearer, urgent. It was as if they were calling me, trying to coax me to open the door. I stopped. What was I doing? Victor's voice rang out from the hallway, and I snapped out of my trance. He was calling me, asking if I wanted to head out. The tension in my body loosened slightly. But the unease didn't leave. It lingered, as if something was watching me. I turned away from the door, trying to shake the feeling. But that's when I noticed it, the smallest of shadows flickering beneath the door. The light from the hallway cast a faint line on the floor, and there it was. A shape. A figure. I froze. My mind screamed at me to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. It was moving. The shadows seemed to shift, elongating, stretching unnaturally. I blinked, and it was gone. The room felt colder. The air thinner. A low hum echoed from behind the door, like something was breathing on the other side. I quickly walked back to the couch, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. It couldn't be real. Could it? Maybe it was the alcohol or the stress from work. But the noise was still there. I tried to ignore it. It was then that I realized there was no way I could. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Victor and I went out for a drink, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had latched onto me the moment I saw that door. I kept looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to be there. Victor kept chatting about something mundane, but I could barely focus. The sounds, the shadow, they were all still fresh in my mind. When we got back to the apartment, it was late. Victor was tired, as usual, and I could tell he was eager to get to bed. But I wasn't ready to sleep, not yet. "Hey, Victor," I said, forcing a casual tone, "are you sure you're okay with me crashing here tonight?" He waved it off. "Yeah, of course." Just don't go near that room, alright? He smiled as if it were a joke, but his eyes didn't match his grin. There was something hiding behind them, something he didn't want to share. I agreed without a second thought, mostly because I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to push it. The night felt heavier than usual, like something was pressing on me from all sides. The apartment was quieter now, with only the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Victor had gone to bed, and I was alone again. I sat on the couch, staring at the door across the room. I didn't want to go near it, but every time I looked at it, the feeling of being watched returned. The faint whispering that had followed me all night was growing louder. It sounded like distant voices, saying something I couldn't quite make out. I pressed my hand to my ear, trying to focus on the words. Nothing. The room was as silent as ever. But I could still hear them. The whispers. I stood up and walked slowly toward the corner of the room. My breath felt shallow, my heart rate picking up speed. The bookshelf still blocked the door, but I could feel a strange pull, something like gravity, urging me to get closer. I reached out and placed my hand on the bookshelf again, my fingers trembling. This time, I noticed something different. The surface of the wood was cold, unnaturally cold, like the air around it had frozen. I shuddered, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. I pulled again, harder this time. The bookshelf didn't move, but the sound from behind the door grew louder. It was as if the whispers were becoming more frantic, more insistent. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. And then, I saw it. A crack appeared along the edge of the door. It was thin, barely noticeable, but it was there. The kind of crack you might find in an old house, but this one seemed to pulse with something otherworldly. It seemed to throb in rhythm with my heartbeat, stretching wider with each passing second. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, but all I could hear was the whispering, growing louder. It was as if the room itself was alive, speaking to me, coaxing me into it. The door was no longer just a door. It was a gateway to something I couldn't understand. Something that wasn't supposed to be. I took a step back, my legs shaky. The crack in the door was widening now, a sliver of darkness visible through it. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were voices, low and unintelligible, but they sounded desperate, almost angry. I could feel the temperature in the room drop. The cold was biting now, sharp like needles against my skin. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to leave, to get away from that door, but something kept me rooted in place. The whispers became clearer. Come closer. I recoiled. It wasn't just in my head anymore. Someone, or something, was speaking to me. The voice sounded like Victor, but distorted, twisted, unrecognizable. Please, come closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move beyond the crack. A figure. A shadow, shifting and stretching like it was reaching out to me. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I turned and fled. I ran out of the living room, nearly tripping over the rug in my haste. I rushed into the kitchen, trying to steady my breath, but it felt like the air had been stolen from my lungs. I leaned against the counter, trying to shake the images from my mind, but they clung to me. The crack. The whispers. The shadow. But there was something else, something even more terrifying. The room had changed. The kitchen, which had been a simple, comforting space just moments ago, now felt suffocating, hostile. The walls seemed to pulse, the lights flickering intermittently. I didn't know what was real anymore. I glanced over at the door leading to the hallway. Victor's room was down that way. But as I looked at it, I froze. The door to Victor's room was ajar. I hadn't noticed that before. The same feeling of being watched gripped me again, stronger than ever. I took a few steps toward the hallway, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I had to check. I had to know if Victor was still there. I reached for the door. Then, I heard it. A loud thud, like something heavy falling to the floor, echoed from behind me. It was coming from the living room. I turned quickly, but the hallway behind me was still empty. And the door to Victor's room was no longer ajar. It was wide open. I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, staring at the now wide open door to Victor's room. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the next. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every breath seemed to draw in more dread. The faint buzzing of the light overhead grew louder, as if the room itself was vibrating with some unseen force. I should have gone to check on Victor, gone to make sure he was okay, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The sound of the thud from the living room echoed in my mind, repeating itself over and over. I tried to move, but my legs were heavy, as though something invisible was holding me back. Then, the whispering began again. It was faint at first, a low murmur from beyond the open door. I couldn't make out the words, but they were unmistakable, a soft, beckoning sound, like the wind carrying secrets from the other side of the world. I felt my pulse quicken. The door to Victor's room swung gently, as if nudged by an unseen hand. The dark interior beyond it seemed to pull me in, each second spent staring at it only deepening the sense of inevitability. I tried to call out to Victor, but my voice faltered, lost in the thickening tension. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to the door, unable to stop myself. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to run back to the living room and forget everything. But something was compelling me, something primal and urgent. As I neared the door, the room behind it seemed to darken, the shadows stretching further into the hallway, as if they were alive, growing at a steady pace, inching toward me. It was unnatural, like something was trying to pull me in, and I was helpless to resist. "Victor?" My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The only response was a soft creak, like the sound of someone shifting in bed. I stepped inside. The door closed softly behind me, though I never touched it. The room was dimly lit, the moonlight from the window barely enough to make out the details. The furniture was sparse, just a bed and a small desk with papers scattered across it. There was a chair in the corner, facing the wall, but no sign of Victor. I stepped forward, my breath shallow, every movement slow and deliberate. My eyes scanned the room, searching for him. But it was like he had vanished. "Victor?" I called again, a little louder this time. Still no response. My heart rate quickened, the air in the room thick with a strange weight. I couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong, like something was waiting in the shadows. My gaze flicked to the corner of the room where the chair sat. The darkness there seemed deeper, as though it was swallowing the light. Then, just as I was about to turn around, I heard it. A soft shuffle, like something, or someone, was moving. I whipped my head back toward the chair. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, something in the corner, just barely visible. My eyes were playing tricks on me, I told myself. It had to be. But then it happened again. A figure, just at the edge of the darkness, stood up from the chair, its movements jerky, unnatural. I took a step back, my heart in my throat. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its shape vague and distorted in the dim light. It was there, then gone in the blink of an eye, swallowed by the shadows once more. I froze. "Victor?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer, but the air around me grew heavier. I could feel it, the presence. It wasn't Victor, I realized. Not anymore. I backed up toward the door, my eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had stood. The shadows seemed to swirl now, darkening and shifting in ways that couldn't be explained. Something was crawling beneath the surface of reality, something that didn't belong. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grasped the handle. The whispers were louder now, urgent, desperate. They weren't coming from Victor's room anymore. They were coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everywhere. I yanked the door open, and the world outside seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The hallway, though still dimly lit, felt like a refuge in comparison to the suffocating darkness of the room behind me. But as I stepped into the hallway, something caught my eye, something in Victor's living room. The door to the far corner, the one I had noticed earlier, was now wide open. The shadows inside the room had deepened, and a dark, formless shape stood just inside the doorway. I couldn't move. The shape was shifting. No, it was growing. It loomed larger, bending in unnatural ways. It was more than a shadow now. It had substance. My breath hitched as I finally managed to tear my gaze away and look toward Victor's bedroom again. And that's when I saw him. Victor stood at the foot of his bed, his back turned to me. But something was wrong. His posture was stiff, his shoulders unnaturally straight, as though he were being held up by invisible strings. His head hung low, his hair covering his face. I wanted to call out to him, to make sure he was okay, but the words wouldn't come. Something in me, something deep in my gut, told me not to approach him. Then, without warning, Victor turned. His eyes were hollow, black voids, empty and lifeless. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, one that didn't belong on his face, as if it were stitched there, forced to exist against its will. "Leave," he whispered, but it wasn't his voice. It was something else. Something darker. "Leave before it's too late." And then the door to the living room slammed shut, trapping me in the hallway with him. My heart raced as I stood paralyzed in the hallway, my eyes locked on Victor. His face, or what used to be his face, was a nightmare made flesh. The smile twisted into something monstrous, his black eyes staring into mine with an emptiness that made my stomach lurch. The darkness of his expression stretched further than I could comprehend. "Leave before it's too late," the voice repeated, but it wasn't Victor's. The words felt wrong. They scraped against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet refused to move. The air around me felt thick, as if it were trying to hold me in place, keep me in this suffocating moment. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in with every passing second. The air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me, but the temperature wasn't just dropping. It was distorting. The cold felt unnatural, like something outside of time itself had invaded this space. My hands shook uncontrollably as I slowly backed away, unable to take my eyes off Victor. Each step I took felt heavier, like invisible chains were wrapping around my ankles, pulling me back. The walls groaned as if they, too, were suffocating, pushing inward, narrowing the space. "Victor," I whispered, though my voice felt distant, as if someone else were speaking. "What happened to you?" The figure, Victor, tilted his head slightly, as though pondering the question. The smile on his face never wavered. His body remained stiff, unnaturally still. The shadows around him seemed to writhe, twisting and shifting like a living thing, as if feeding off the atmosphere. "Not Victor," the voice hissed, slithering out from between the gaps in his smile. "Never Victor." I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The room, Victor's room, felt even darker now, the shadows stretching further, reaching toward me, grasping for my mind. The whispering returned, this time louder, clearer, and with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, my thoughts, but twisted. Foreign. Dark. And they were all shouting at me, overwhelming me. "Run. Don't look. It's not real. It's not him. It's not Victor." The walls around me felt like they were closing in tighter, pushing me into the dark space between them. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I raced down the hallway toward the front door. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, the distance between me and the exit growing with every step. It felt like I was running in place, like the apartment had turned into a maze that had no way out. I reached the door. It was locked. I pulled at the handle frantically, my fingers slipping as the door refused to open. The sound of my own breath, harsh and erratic, filled my ears, drowning out everything else. Behind me, I could feel the figure from Victor's room moving, coming closer. The shadows pressed against the walls, growing thicker, more suffocating. A low rumble vibrated the floor beneath my feet. The entire building seemed to groan, like it was alive. Its walls were shifting, warping, and I could feel it in my bones. There was no way out. Not this time. I turned, my back pressed against the door, and found myself staring into the darkness that had once been Victor's bedroom. The air was thick with the smell of something burning, a pungent, metallic scent that made me gag. The shadows had deepened, now writhing and twisting into strange, jagged shapes. They moved with purpose, crawling along the floor, up the walls, bending toward me, as if they had a mind of their own. "Why are you here?" The voice, Victor's voice, whispered from the darkness. "You should have left." I couldn't answer. My mind was unraveling, and the walls were closing in even tighter. The whispers, now a deafening chorus of indecipherable words, grew louder and louder, overwhelming my senses. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness of the room. It was tall, so tall that it seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the room. Its shape was more than human, its limbs were long, twisted, and thin, and its head. It was just an empty void, a gaping hole where a face should be, like it had been torn away, leaving only a blackened abyss. I froze. My body refused to move, as though I was rooted to the spot. I could feel its presence, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. The shadow reached toward me, its fingers stretching impossibly long, each one ending in sharp, jagged tips. The whispers turned into growls, deep and guttural, like something ancient and malevolent was rising from the very core of the earth. The room spun around me, reality warping with every passing second. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My voice had been stolen by the terror that gripped me. I had to leave. I had to get out. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnatural and jerky. The shadows around it twisted, stretching toward me like tendrils, and the temperature dropped even more. With a burst of adrenaline, I shoved the door open. The living room was as dark and silent as before, but now the shadows seemed to follow me, stalking me, crawling along the edges of the walls like hungry beasts. I didn't know where I was going anymore. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. I ran toward the window, desperate to escape, but as I got closer, I noticed something. The window, it wasn't a window anymore. It was a wall. A solid, featureless wall. I slammed my hands against it, panic surging through me, but it was no use. The apartment had changed. It had shifted. It was alive. A sound, a scraping noise, like claws dragging across the floor, came from behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know that the shadows were closing in, that the figure was getting closer. I was trapped. And then, I heard it again, Victor's voice, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a scream. A scream that tore through the darkness, echoing in my mind, filling the room, drowning everything else. The scream filled the room, a horrible, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate off the walls and deep into my skull. Victor's voice had turned into something unrecognizable, a sound of pure agony and fear, stretched and torn beyond human comprehension. It felt like the very air was being sucked out of the room, and I could taste the metal tang of panic on the back of my throat. I stumbled backward, my eyes wide and searching for any escape. But there was none. The window I had once seen, the door I had tried to open, all of it had become one seamless, featureless wall, as if the apartment had swallowed itself whole. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a dull thrum that made it harder to focus. The room was no longer just a room. It was something else, alive, hungry, and closing in. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. The shadows had thickened, wrapping themselves around the furniture, creeping across the floor in a slow, deliberate motion. It was as though the darkness was alive, as though it had become sentient, aware of my every movement. And then, the figure appeared again. It didn't walk. It floated, its long, thin limbs stretched impossibly, moving without a sound. The shadows seemed to cling to it, twisting and spiraling as if the darkness itself was becoming part of it. The figure was taller than before, a looming presence that filled the entire space, blocking out the last remnants of light. Its form was no longer a vague, shifting shape. Now, it had a more definite structure, something that was both human and not, with the shape of limbs, the outline of a body, but no face. Just the hollow emptiness where a face should be. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The thing moved closer, its limbs stretching and contracting with an unnatural fluidity. It wasn't moving like anything I had ever seen. It was too wrong, too alien. The shadows writhed around it, distorting the very air, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. "Victor?" I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely audible. There was no response, only the continued scream, now a distorted echo in my mind, as though it was coming from a place far beyond the walls of the room. "Leave. Leave. Leave." The command wasn't spoken. It was felt, a pull, an overwhelming need to obey, to escape. It wasn't just Victor's voice anymore. The room itself was speaking to me, pushing me away from the thing, urging me to run. But the very walls seemed to close in, tightening with every heartbeat. The space around me was shrinking, warping, folding in on itself. "You should never have come here." I tried to move, but my body was frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows were thickening, curling at the edges of the room, slithering along the floor like liquid darkness. They reached for my ankles, wrapping around them with cold, unnatural tendrils. They tugged at my legs, pulling me back toward the center of the room. The figure was still coming closer, its limbs long and thin, but now there was something else, something I could feel rather than see. A presence, a weight, a hunger. It was hungry for me, hungry for anyone who entered this place. My mind raced, desperate for a way out, for something to break the grip of the shadows. The door. I turned my head quickly, but there was no door, only a dark, infinite wall that stretched to the edges of my vision. The door I had tried to open before was gone. The hallway I had once seen was now just an unreachable void. The room had swallowed everything. I was trapped. The shadows seemed to pulse, breathing in time with the beat of my heart. I could feel them touching me, tugging at me, pulling me down into the very ground beneath my feet. I tried to scream, to shout, but the air felt heavy, like I was drowning in it. Every breath I took was filled with something foul, something unnatural. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A glimmer, a tiny flicker of light in the farthest corner of the room, beyond the swirling shadows. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. A doorway. A chance. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. With everything I had left, I ran toward it. But as I moved, the shadows attacked. They lashed out at me with lightning speed, their cold tendrils wrapping around my limbs, pulling at my skin, tugging at my mind. They hissed, low and guttural, their voices like a chorus of anguish, all whispering the same thing. You cannot leave. I pushed through the pain, through the fear, but with every step I took, the distance between me and the light grew. The shadows clawed at my mind, dragging me back into the blackness. The figure was getting closer, its long, skeletal hand reaching for me, its empty gaze piercing through the dark. Then, just as I thought I would be swallowed whole, I reached the light. I didn't question it. I dove into it, throwing myself into whatever it was, not knowing what I was about to face. The world around me ripped apart. Everything spun. The room shattered. The walls dissolved. The air turned to static, buzzing and crackling with energy. For a moment, I felt like I was floating, weightless, suspended in a place that was neither here nor there. And then, nothing. Complete silence. I opened my eyes, expecting to be back in the hallway, back in the apartment, but instead, I was somewhere else. A different room. It was silent. Empty. But not the silence of peace. It was an oppressive, smothering quiet. The air was heavy with an unbearable weight, a tension that seemed to stretch through time itself. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the room itself felt wrong, just like before. It was as if I had never left. The shadows were still there, and they were watching. It started with something small. So small that I almost dismissed it, assuming it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had just returned to my apartment after a long day at work. The city was its usual noisy self, cars honking, people shouting, the hum of the streets constantly filling the air. But inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. That was when I first noticed it. I was standing by the window, absent-mindedly staring out at the busy street below. I needed a moment of calm, a break from the constant barrage of thoughts in my head. The soft light from the street lamps outside filtered through the glass, casting long shadows inside the room. And then, I saw it. A small, red dot appeared on the glass. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, like a tiny blemish. I reached out, thinking it was a smudge or a speck of dust, but when I touched the glass, the dot didn't move. It was as if it had always been there. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It was probably nothing, just a trick of the light. Maybe a raindrop, maybe a bug. But then, as I watched, the dot shifted slightly. Not much, but just enough to make my stomach turn. I'm imagining things, I thought. But the unease remained. I pulled away from the window, trying to ignore the strange sensation creeping up my spine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about the apartment didn't feel quite right. The silence. The stillness. It felt off. I tried to distract myself, moving to the kitchen to grab a drink. But the thought of that tiny red dot gnawed at me. I couldn't shake it. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I saw another one. This time, a bit further up the glass. Another small, red dot. But now it was slightly larger than the first. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed my hand to the window again, as if to somehow erase what I was seeing. But the dots remained. And there were more of them. Several small, bright red dots scattered across the glass, each one larger than the last. What the hell is this? I reached for my phone, quickly dialing my friend, Victor. He had always been the one I turned to when things felt wrong. But as the phone rang in my ear, I saw something else. The dots weren't still anymore. They were moving. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. I dropped the phone. The dots on the glass began to shift, moving from one spot to another, as if they were alive. I felt my throat tighten. My pulse quickened. The sensation in my gut was no longer one of curiosity, it was dread. I stepped back, my feet stumbling over the carpet as I backed away from the window. The dots weren't just shifting anymore. They were growing. Expanding. I didn't know what they were or why they were appearing. But I knew one thing for sure. They were dangerous. I had to get out of here. Now. I felt my heartbeat in my ears as I ran for the door. But the moment I turned away from the window, I heard it. A soft sound, almost like the faintest whisper of movement. I froze. The air felt heavier, as if it were thickening around me. The whisper turned into something else, like a faint scratching, a tapping at the glass. I turned back to the window, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. The dots. They weren't dots anymore. They had grown larger, more defined. And they were moving faster. I could see them clearly now, as if the glass itself had become a canvas for some unseen force to paint on. The scratching noise grew louder, almost frantic. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the dots split into two. A red crack spread from it, slowly turning into a jagged line. The other dots followed suit, their once smooth, round forms now sharp and fractured, like broken glass. They began to multiply, splitting and spreading across the window in a chaotic, disturbing pattern. I staggered backward, my mind spinning. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. But even as I thought that, the dots began to move again. They weren't just growing or splitting. They were coming toward me. And in the silence of the apartment, all I could hear was the sound of those red dots scratching at the glass, as if they were trying to get inside. I couldn't breathe. My eyes were glued to the window, watching in terror as the red dots, if you could even call them dots anymore, continued to crawl and split, multiplying across the glass. There was no rhyme or reason to their pattern. They just kept growing, expanding with an unnatural persistence. They weren't just on the window, they seemed to be crawling on the very air around me, as if they were eating through the space itself. What is this? I backed away slowly, my legs shaky, each step feeling like I was dragging myself through thick tar. My mind couldn't keep up with the absurdity of what I was seeing. It made no sense. But it was real. I could feel it, see it. The dots continued to stretch out in jagged lines. Some of them began to flicker, almost as if they were blinking in and out of existence. It was like the glass itself was alive, a pulsating, breathing thing. I had to get away from it. I had to escape. But the door... I turned quickly, desperate to reach the exit. The door... But it wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, but it was stuck. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. No, no, no! I stepped back from the door, the breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. I looked back at the window, as if hoping the dots would have vanished in the seconds I had turned away. But no! They were still there. Worse than before. The scratching sound had intensified. It was no longer just a faint tapping. It was loud, an unnerving noise like nails on a chalkboard, relentless and impossible to ignore. The glass was shaking, as if something was pushing from the other side, forcing the dots to expand further with each passing moment. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart pounded in my chest, blood roaring in my ears. The apartment felt smaller now. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. The floor felt unstable, shifting beneath my feet. I turned toward the kitchen, the only other exit I could think of. But as I walked toward it, I noticed something even more horrifying. The kitchen window. The same red dots. But they weren't just on the surface of the glass. No, they were inside the window now, embedded deep within the frame. As if something, or someone, was marking the very foundation of the space I had called home. The kitchen seemed wrong. The lights overhead flickered in a slow, unnatural rhythm. Everything around me felt off, as if the apartment had become a part of the terrifying phenomenon that was now consuming it. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer. My hands were shaking violently, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to defend myself, even though I had no idea what I was fighting. I wasn't even sure what had begun this nightmare. But if it was inside the walls of my home, I had to protect myself. The sound of the scratching at the windows grew louder. It was coming from all sides now, like an army of something unseen trying to claw its way inside. I closed my eyes for a moment, my breathing shallow. Think. Stay calm. But all I could hear was the sound of those dots, their movement, growing in volume and intensity. I heard a crash. The glass in the window shattered. But not in the way it should have. It didn't break into sharp, clean shards. Instead, the glass twisted and warped like a deforming mass that didn't belong to this reality. The red dots pushed against the glass from the inside, breaking it open with an eerie, deliberate slowness. It was as if the glass was part of some larger system, an organism that had come to life. I backed away, clutching the knife tightly in my hand. Sweat dripped down my face as the oppressive air around me thickened. My apartment had transformed into something unrecognizable, an unnatural space where logic and reason had no place. And then, for a brief moment, it stopped. The scratching, the movement, everything went quiet. I stood still, barely daring to breathe, but the silence was worse than the noise. It was as if the world had frozen. The room around me was no longer mine. It was something else. Something that didn't belong to me. Something that was waiting for me to make the next move. I turned slowly, glancing back at the broken window, then back toward the door. But before I could react, I saw something. A shape. A shadow. It was moving through the apartment, sliding between the cracks in the walls and ceiling, like something crawling. My eyes went wide. I could see its outline now, twisting, folding. The shadow was alive, and it was getting closer. It's here. My hand tightened around the knife. I had to act. But what if it wasn't real? What if I was seeing things? My mind raced in conflicting directions as panic bubbled up in my chest, choking me. But I didn't have time to think. The shadow was almost on me. And then, the red dots on the glass began to pulse. I realized, too late, that they weren't just dots. They were a signal. A pattern. And whatever had created them, whatever force had drawn them on the glass, was no longer outside. It was inside. And it was coming for me. I could feel it. The air around me had thickened, become heavier, like it was pressing against my chest with each breath I took. The room, no, the entire apartment, felt like it was shifting, bending in unnatural ways. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of air seemed to hold a sense of impending doom. It was as though the very space I stood in had become something else, a place I no longer recognized. The shadow was still there, slithering through the cracks in the walls, growing closer with every passing second. It wasn't human. I knew that instinctively. There was something otherworldly about its movement, the way it folded into itself, as if the very fabric of reality was being manipulated by its presence. I could almost hear it whispering through the silence. The sound was faint at first, like a distant hum, but then it grew louder, sharper, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, all murmuring the same phrase over and over again. Come closer, come closer. I gripped the knife harder, the metal digging into my palm, but my legs were frozen. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the broken window. The red dots, they were no longer dots. They had become larger, spreading out across the glass like some grotesque stain that threatened to engulf the entire window. But worse than that, they were pulsing now. In the corner of my eye, I saw something move. The shadow. It was closer than before, just behind the kitchen doorway now. I had no time to think, no time to plan. I turned, lunged for the door, and slam, it wouldn't open. The damn thing was stuck, just like before. My heart began to race, and the air seemed to thin as I frantically twisted the doorknob. But it wouldn't budge. The shadow was there now. I could see it clearly, black tendrils stretching across the walls, reaching toward me like fingers, like something alive, hungry. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, suffocating, as if the very air was being stolen from me. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I turned again, my mind a blur of frantic thoughts. I have to get out of here. I have to survive. I turned to the window, desperate for anything, any chance of escape. And that's when I saw it, the most horrifying thing yet. The glass. It was moving. Not just cracked or shattered, but the pieces of glass were shifting on their own, sliding across the frame as though they were separate, sentient beings. The red dots weren't just marks anymore, they were the cause of this. They were controlling everything. The window was no longer just a window. It was an opening, an entryway. I saw something move outside, just beyond the glass. A shape. A figure, tall and thin, with limbs that bent and twisted in ways that defied logic. It stood there, motionless, watching me. It had no face, just a massive shadow where its head should have been, but I could feel its gaze, cold, empty, all-seeing. It's watching me. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. There was no escaping it. No running. I could feel it, crawling closer, feeling its presence like a weight in the room. My eyes darted around, searching for anything, any means of protection, but there was nothing. The apartment was completely empty. The knife was the only thing I had, and it felt insignificant now, a mere toy against whatever this thing was. I stumbled back, falling to the floor, my body trembling with panic. My mind raced with possibilities. What was this thing? Where had it come from? And what did the red dots mean? They had started as small, insignificant marks, but now they were consuming the glass, the walls, the very air around me. The shape outside moved again, slowly, deliberately, its limbs stretching and contracting like rubber. It stepped closer to the window, pressing against the glass as if testing it, as if it wanted to see if I would open the door for it. It wanted me to invite it in. I can't let it in. I can't. But the apartment had already become its prison. The very walls had bent and twisted to its will. The glass, the red dots, they were all part of something greater, something darker, and I had been foolish enough to think I could just ignore it. I had been too slow, too blind. Now, there was no escape. I reached for the knife again, my fingers cold and trembling. But as I did, I saw something else. The door. It was open. I didn't hear it open. I didn't see the handle turn. But there it was, an empty doorway leading into the hallway outside. A way out. Get out. Now. I stood, my legs unsteady, but I couldn't stop myself from moving toward the door. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The apartment had become a trap, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. I reached the doorframe, my hand resting on the handle. But before I could step outside, I heard a sound, a scraping noise, like something sharp running across the floor. I froze. And then, I saw it. The red dots, there were more now, everywhere. They covered the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The entire apartment was alive with their presence. They were growing, swelling, like they were feeding on the space itself. The shape outside had pressed itself against the glass, its form warping and stretching, its fingers curling in toward the window, reaching for me. And then, the red dots on the glass began to move. They weren't just moving now, they were crawling. Toward me. Crawling into me. The marks weren't random anymore. They were forming something, a pattern, a symbol. A symbol I had seen before. It was the same symbol I had drawn as a child. The memory slammed into me like a tidal wave. I had forgotten it for so long, buried it in the back of my mind. But now, it was here. It was real. The symbol that had haunted my dreams. The mark that had always been a warning. And now it was coming for me. I backed away from the door, the walls pressing in on me, the red dots chasing me, suffocating me. I didn't know what they were, or what they wanted. But I knew one thing, I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I turned. I ran, but I was already too late. The hallway was longer than I remembered. The walls seemed to stretch, like the apartment had grown too large, too vast, until it swallowed me whole. Each step I took echoed in the silence, louder than it should have been, like it was amplifying my fear. My breath was shallow, my chest tight, but there was no turning back now. I had to get out. I had to leave before the red dots consumed everything, before whatever was outside broke through. I ran. My feet hit the cold floor, pounding like a drumbeat. The shadows on the walls seemed to follow me, shifting, stretching, elongating with every step. I dared not look behind me, but I could feel them there, those eyes, that presence, watching. Always watching. The hallway twisted, the light flickering above me in short bursts, like a strobe. Each flicker seemed to distort the space, warping the reality around me. It's not real. It can't be real. But then, the smell. That horrible stench of rot and decay. It wasn't just in the air, it was in my lungs, thick and choking. It clawed at my throat, forced its way into my senses. I stopped, gasping for air, my hands clutching my stomach as if I could hold the bile from rising. The scent was coming from the walls, from the shadows. And then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails on glass. Or maybe bone. I turned. At the end of the hallway, in the farthest corner where the light barely reached, the red dots were there. Not just on the walls, but now, crawling. They moved with purpose, like something alive, like they were hunting. They covered the floor, stretching out in tendrils that slithered toward me. And behind them, the shape. It was closer now. The figure that had been outside was no longer a vague shadow in the distance. It had materialized, a tall, thin being, its body twisted and grotesque. Its limbs were far too long, too thin, and they moved with a sickening fluidity that was not human. It had no face, but I could feel it, its eyes, those eyes, glaring into mine, burning with malice. It was a puppet, its movements jerky and unnatural, yet it moved with an intent that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs refused to move, and my heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I have to escape. I can't stay here. But the hallway, the apartment, had become a maze, twisting around me, bending toward the thing that was coming closer. The figure's limbs stretched, and the red dots, they were everywhere now. Crawling on the floor, on the walls, even on the ceiling. I can't get out. I turned, half blinded by panic, and stumbled into the kitchen. The room was just as silent as the rest of the apartment, but the air in here felt different. It felt wrong, as if the room itself was waiting, watching. I grabbed a chair, lifting it above my head, ready to smash it against the window. There was no time to think, no time to plan. The only thing I could do was get away. The glass was already covered in red, the dots swirling across its surface, converging into a shape. A face. Not human, not even close, but something monstrous. It watched me, unblinking. The dots were no longer just on the glass. They were in the room, covering everything. The walls, the floor, even my hands, the tips of my fingers. It was as if I were becoming part of the pattern, part of the web. I swung the chair, desperate, but the glass didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. Instead, the dots pulsed, vibrating against the glass like a living thing, pushing back against the force. The chair slipped from my grasp, and I stumbled back, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Then I heard it again. That scraping sound. It was louder now, closer, like something was dragging itself across the floor, pulling itself toward me. I looked down at the floor, the dark, murky surface of the kitchen tiles now covered in the red dots, crawling, reaching, as though they were alive. They shifted and pulled together into a single, massive shape, dark and shifting like ink spreading across paper. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was everything. This is it. This is how it ends. I turned, my pulse racing, and ran. I couldn't look behind me. I couldn't let myself see what was chasing me. I just had to get to the door. I had to get out. I reached the door to the street, the cold night air brushing against my skin, and yanked the handle. It opened. But it wasn't the street outside. The door opened into nothing. There was only darkness beyond, a black void that seemed to stretch on forever. I stepped back, my breath ragged, my heart racing in my chest. The hallway behind me had disappeared. The apartment was gone, swallowed up by the darkness, leaving only the feeling of being trapped in a void. I turned. The figure was there, standing in the doorway, its limbs twisted and elongated. It grinned, but there was no face, only a black void, an abyss that seemed to swallow up the light. The red dots were everywhere now, covering every inch of space, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. The walls, the floors, the air, they were all part of it now. The red dots were everywhere, consuming everything. And then I heard it. A voice. No, not a voice, voices. Thousands of them, whispering in unison, the sound of thousands of broken dreams. Come closer. I ran, my legs carrying me faster than I ever thought possible. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. But I knew, deep down, that it was too late. There was no escape. The red dots had already claimed me. And now, I was a part of them. A part of the darkness. And as I ran, I could feel the walls closing in around me. I could feel them, waiting, watching. And the red dots, they were moving again. I could feel it. The air had changed. It was colder now, the chill biting at my skin like tiny shards of ice. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was the pressure, the heaviness that weighed down on my chest, making each breath feel like I was sucking air through a narrow straw. The darkness around me felt alive. I was still running, but I didn't know where I was going. There was no destination. No exit. The door I had fled through had disappeared, swallowed up by the abyss. The hallway I had been in before was gone, replaced by a void that stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and formless. I stopped. I had to stop. The weight of it all was too much. The red dots, the whispers, the figure chasing me through the darkness. The very air around me seemed to breathe with me. It was as though the darkness was alive, its pulse matching the beat of my own heart. I turned around slowly. The figure was closer now. Too close. Its limbs moved with a sickening, jerky fluidity, each motion warped and distorted, like a puppet on strings pulled by some unseen hand. The red dots were growing more intense, swirling in the air around it like a living cloud of terror, feeding off my fear. Its face, if you could call it that, was still a black void. But now, I could hear it. A low, guttural whisper, like the scraping of nails against wood. Come closer. Come see what we've made. The words echoed in my mind, but there was no mouth, no sound. Just the feeling of being drawn in, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff and the wind was pushing me closer to the edge, no matter how hard I tried to resist. I wanted to run. I had to run. But my body wouldn't move. My legs were rooted to the floor, my muscles stiff with fear. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. And then I saw it. A flicker of red, small and distant at first, but growing larger. The dots. They were moving again. They weren't just scattered across the walls, the floors, and the air anymore. They were forming shapes, patterns, figures. First, they looked like shadows, like the twisted reflections of something that didn't belong in this world. But then, as the dots shifted, the figures began to take form. Faces. Faces that were half-formed, like they were in the process of being sculpted from nothing. But they weren't human. No, these faces were something else entirely. Hollow eyes, sharp, angular features, twisted mouths that seemed to curl into unnatural smiles. Their faces were just as distorted as the figure that stalked me, as if they were all connected by the same dark force, the same malevolent presence that was controlling everything around me. I stumbled backward, my legs finally obeying me. But it was too late. The figure lunged. Its arms shot out, long and thin like tendrils, grasping at me with terrifying speed. I felt its cold, clammy fingers brush my skin, sending a wave of revulsion through my body. The dots were everywhere now, swirling around me, feeding off my fear, growing with every heartbeat. I reached out, my hands desperately searching for something, anything, to defend myself. There was nothing. Just darkness and the red dots, moving closer and closer, suffocating me. But then, in the distance, I saw it. A light. A tiny, flickering light, almost imperceptible against the overwhelming darkness. It was coming from somewhere. Somewhere far away, but just within reach. Without thinking, I ran toward it. I pushed through the darkness, my legs moving faster now, fueled by desperation. The figure was behind me, its breath, if it had one, hot on my neck. The red dots were following, closing in like a swarm of insects, but I kept running. I had to reach that light. The further I ran, the more distorted the world around me became. The hallway twisted and bent, the walls warping like they were made of liquid, stretching out of shape. The light grew brighter, but the closer I got, the more I could feel it slipping away. Like it was a mirage, something I could never truly reach. The red dots were suffocating me now, pressing in from every angle. I could hear the whispers again, clearer now, louder, like they were inside my head. You can't escape. You're ours. You're part of the pattern now. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I burst through. The light was blinding. I stumbled, gasping for air, blinking rapidly as my eyes adjusted. The dark hallway, the dots, the figure, all of it was gone. In its place was reality. I was outside. The familiar world. The street I had known for years. The night sky above me, the cool breeze brushing against my skin. But as I stood there, breathing heavily, I felt it. Something was wrong. The red dots. They weren't gone. They were still with me. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in them. On my skin, like tiny, glowing tattoos, they began to shift and swirl, moving across my fingers, my arms, as if they were alive, crawling beneath my skin. And then, I heard it again. That whisper, that voice. But this time, it was different. You thought you escaped. You thought you were free. I turned around, my eyes scanning the empty street. There was nothing there. But I could feel it. The figure was waiting, watching. And as the dots continued to shift beneath my skin, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The pattern was already inside me. It was just a glance at first. A casual, almost absent-minded glance at the mirror hanging on the wall. I wasn't even thinking about it. But then I saw it. A figure. Standing behind me. I froze. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't felt anyone come in. But there it was, a tall, shadowy figure standing just behind me in the reflection. Its outline was hazy, like it was made from smoke or mist. And its eyes. I couldn't see them clearly, but they were there, staring right at me, cold and unsettling. My heart raced. I blinked. I looked again. There was nothing. Just me. Just my reflection. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, feeling a stupid sense of relief. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a trick of the light. But when I turned around, I saw it again. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot, inches behind me. I could feel its presence, like the air around me had thickened. But I was alone. There was no one behind me. Panic clawed at the back of my mind. What is this? I spun around once more. The room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, distant and normal. I turned back to the mirror. There was the figure, again. Closer this time. I reached up to wipe the sweat from my brow, but my hand was shaking. My breath was shallow. I felt lightheaded, my vision swimming for a moment. No, this can't be real. It's just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. I backed away from the mirror slowly, trying not to look at it, but I could feel its presence right behind me. The reflection was like a warning, a reminder that something was there, something I couldn't explain. The figure moved. Just a slight shift. The shadows around it seemed to ripple, like something was trying to break free. Its shape elongated, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. I stumbled back, bumping into the chair behind me. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. The figure in the reflection was changing. It had been standing still, but now its arms were slowly raising, reaching toward me. The air was cold. Cold like death. Why can't I move? My body was frozen in place, my feet nailed to the floor. The reflection in the mirror was too much. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, and yet it felt like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I tried to blink the image away, to look at something else, but the figure in the mirror refused to vanish. Then I saw it. Its hand, raised in the reflection, was now inches from my shoulder. I turned, terrified, expecting it to be there. But there was nothing. The room was empty. Was it in my head? No. It wasn't. In the mirror, the figure was there, so close now. I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Suddenly, it smiled. A wide, twisted grin that stretched impossibly across its face. The eyes, now visible, were hollow, dark pits that seemed to devour the light. It was grinning at me, as if it knew something I didn't. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward in the reflection. It moved. It moved. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. Something alive. Something that could reach me. The mirror cracked. A thin, jagged line appeared down the center, splitting the image in two. The figure, still smiling, reached through the crack. I screamed. And that's when I felt it, the cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. My body went stiff. I couldn't move. The hand on my shoulder was ice cold. I could feel the weight of it pressing into the fabric of my shirt, but I didn't dare turn around to face whatever it was. It was like my body refused to acknowledge it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The reflection in the shattered mirror, no, it wasn't just a reflection anymore, was now reaching through the crack, pulling itself closer, step by step, like it was stepping out of the mirror into the very room with me. My heart pounded in my chest. This isn't real. It can't be. I wanted to scream, to break free from whatever paralysis had gripped me, but my throat was dry, my mind cloudy. I swallowed hard, trying to regain control of my body, but the hand on my shoulder tightened, pulling me backward, forcing me toward the broken mirror. I shook my head, trying to deny it. It's not real, it's not real, it's not real. But I could feel the weight of the hand. I could feel its coldness seeping through the fabric of my shirt. And then, I heard it. A low, guttural whisper from behind me, just inches from my ear. You can't escape. The voice was raspy, like dry leaves being crunched underfoot, but there was something chillingly familiar about it. It made my skin crawl, like it was inside my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. It felt like a memory, something from long ago, but it was twisted, wrong. No. No, no, no. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The hand was still there, pushing harder now, like it was trying to pull me into the mirror. I closed my eyes, praying that when I opened them, it would all be gone, but it wasn't. It was still there. I could feel the dark presence right behind me, its breath, if it even had breath, cold on my neck. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I have to get out of here. Without thinking, I jerked forward, ripping myself free from the cold grip that held me in place. I ran, no! I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, desperate to leave whatever this was behind. The door slammed shut in front of me. I reached for the handle, but it was locked. It was locked. I spun around, looking for another way out, but the room, it wasn't the same anymore. The walls had shifted. The door had vanished. I was no longer in the room I had started in. The layout had completely changed, but everything was so familiar, like a dream where nothing makes sense, but you recognize everything. The corners of the room were too dark, the ceiling too high. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. The whisper came again, louder this time. You can't run. I turned in every direction, but there was no one there. The room, however, felt alive with some kind of presence, something watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. The shadows had grown deeper, stretching longer, swallowing the light that seemed to fade away. I rushed to the window, hoping to break it open, but it was sealed shut, just like the door. I hammered my fists against the glass, but the window wouldn't budge. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the glass, standing just behind me, was the figure. Closer now. Its face, it was more defined. Its features were becoming clearer. The twisted grin had stretched wider, the eyes were hollow, darker, consuming. But what terrified me the most was how real it looked now. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just an illusion. It was there. I slowly turned around, expecting to see it, but the space behind me was empty. Just the dark, empty room. But then I felt it again, the hand. Cold, hard fingers gripping my wrist. I jerked away. I turned, this time. I forced myself to look, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The only sound was the faint thud of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I was losing my mind. I had to be. This couldn't be real. But why did it feel so real? The shadows around me thickened, swirling, moving. The air was thick with tension. I could feel the oppressive weight of something closing in on me, and it wasn't just my imagination. It was real. I backed into the corner, my hands trembling. The figure, it was growing stronger. It was no longer just a shadow in the mirror. It was coming for me. Its presence surrounded me. I could feel the air grow colder with every breath. And then, I saw the crack in the mirror widen, the fractured glass slowly pulling apart like it was reaching toward me. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen. I couldn't move. And then I saw it, its hand, reaching for me from the mirror, stretching out with unnatural speed. Its fingers were long, impossibly thin, and as they touched my arm, I felt a jolt of ice coldness shoot through me. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered, its voice now close, too close. "Now, you're mine." The grip on my arm tightened, pulling me toward the mirror. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, suffocated by the sudden wave of cold that washed over me. It wasn't just the temperature, it was a presence, something ancient and malevolent, crawling under my skin. The fingers that held me were impossibly thin, like dry branches, and as they wrapped around my wrist, I could feel the frost biting through my clothes. The reflection in the mirror, it wasn't mine anymore. The face staring back at me wasn't me. It was a distorted version of me, my eyes wide in terror, but the thing in the mirror wore my fear like a mask. This isn't happening. This isn't real. I tried to fight it, to break free, but my body refused to cooperate. Every movement felt like swimming through thick mud, like I was stuck in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The thing, whatever it was, pulled me closer, inch by inch, its grip never loosening. The glass of the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by an invisible force. I could hear a faint humming noise, a vibration deep within my chest. The air around me grew heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. It was like the room was collapsing in on itself. The walls seemed to bend, the corners stretching in impossible angles. I looked back at the figure in the mirror. It was smiling. The smile was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face, showing teeth that were too sharp, too many. I tried to look away, but my eyes were drawn back to it, unable to look anywhere else. No. No, no, no. I turned my head, looking around for anything to help, but everything felt so wrong. The walls had turned darker, the shadows thicker. It was like the room itself was being consumed by the reflection, and with every second, I felt like I was being pulled deeper into it. The door was still sealed shut. The window locked. There was nowhere to run. "Let go of me," I whispered, my voice shaking. The thing in the mirror didn't answer. Instead, its face began to twist, like it was distorting itself, reshaping. The eyes that had once been empty, now filled with something, stared right through me, as if it knew everything about me. It was mocking me, laughing silently as I struggled. I could feel its cold presence seeping into me. My chest tightened. I felt suffocated, like the air around me was being sucked away. I gasped for breath, but it was no use. The cold seeped into my bones, numbing me until I felt like I was becoming part of the reflection itself. Suddenly, the grip on my wrist loosened. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor, my heart racing, my head spinning. I looked up, expecting the worst, but the mirror was still there, only now it seemed farther away, as if I were being pushed back. And then, I saw it. In the reflection, the thing wasn't just looking at me anymore. It was moving, stepping out from the shattered glass, slowly but surely. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The glass seemed to bend with its movements, as if it were no longer a solid surface, but a thin veil between worlds. The thing took another step, and my pulse quickened. I scrambled to my feet, panic bubbling up in my chest. I had to get away. I had to do something. Anything. Get away from me. I shouted, but my voice was weak, feeble against the growing terror that wrapped itself around me. It didn't stop. The thing in the mirror, the thing that was me, yet wasn't, stepped forward again. Closer now. Closer than ever. Its hand reached out, and I could feel the air grow colder as it extended toward me. I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my breath shallow, my heartbeat erratic. I was trapped in its gaze, unable to escape. And then, the reflection reached for me. Its hand emerged from the glass, impossibly long, the fingers curling toward my face. The room went silent. The shadows seemed to fall still, waiting, as if they, too, were holding their breath. "You're mine now," the thing whispered, its voice coming from everywhere, surrounding me. It echoed in my head, filling my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I felt its fingers brush against my cheek, cold, like ice. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling that came with it, the suffocating sense that I was losing myself, that the thing in the mirror was taking me, pulling me into its world. I screamed, a ragged, desperate sound, but it was as if the scream had no sound. It was swallowed by the reflection, by the darkness that was now spilling out of the mirror. The thing grinned, showing those twisted, sharp teeth. The cold spread, rushing through my veins, and I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against my chest. This can't be real. It can't be. And then, in one sharp motion, the reflection, it lunged forward, its fingers wrapping around my throat, tightening. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the twisted smile of the thing in the mirror, its eyes burning with something terrible, something ancient. The darkness swallowed me whole. There was no light, no sound, just an oppressive silence, broken only by the frantic beating of my heart. My chest felt tight, every breath a struggle, as if the air had thickened into something heavier, colder, suffocating. I couldn't move. I couldn't see. But I could feel it. That chilling presence, the cold that still clung to my skin, the sensation of being watched, the crushing weight pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to escape, but every instinct I had was buried under the weight of something other. Something ancient and unrelenting. Where was I? What happened? Was this still the same room, the same house? Or had I crossed over into something else? I blinked. For a moment, nothing changed. But then, slowly, the darkness began to shift, like ink spreading across water, creating vague shapes, shadows that danced just out of reach of my senses. A figure, no, multiple figures, began to form. They were formless at first, indistinct, but as they approached, their outlines sharpened, becoming clearer. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were locked in place. They were coming for me, moving in sync, a silent, crawling tide that seemed to fill the space around me. Their presence was suffocating, the air growing colder with every step they took. One of them reached out, a hand, long and thin, with fingers that seemed to stretch like branches, moving toward me, brushing against my skin. It was like ice, sharp, unbearable. The touch was both nothing and everything, like the touch of the thing in the mirror, only now, it wasn't just a reflection. It was here. In my world. In me. A whisper. A voice that echoed from nowhere and everywhere. You can't escape. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed, held in place by something unseen, something that knew me. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. You thought you could outrun it. But you can't. It's always been here. The shadows continued to advance, drawing closer, their twisted, distorted faces emerging from the dark. Eyes without life stared at me, mouths stretched in twisted grins, revealing jagged teeth. The figures moved, not in the way people do, but in unnatural, jerky motions, like they were never meant to be seen by human eyes. Why are you doing this? I gasped, my voice breaking through the silence. Another figure stepped forward, its form now solidifying into something familiar. The same twisted grin, the same cold eyes. It was the thing from the mirror, but it wasn't just in the glass anymore. It was standing right in front of me, its eyes boring into mine. You asked for it, it said, its voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to echo in my skull. You looked, and now you're part of it. Welcome. It raised its hand, the fingers twisting unnaturally, and I felt the cold press against my chest, its icy touch spreading through me like poison. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that felt like it was carving its way into my soul. I wanted to scream, but the words died before they left my throat. The thing's grip tightened, pulling me in, dragging me deeper into the darkness, into the cold, into the world beyond the mirror. The air around me seemed to distort, like the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The walls of the room, if this even was a room anymore, began to stretch and distort, expanding into a vast, endless void. I could no longer tell up from down. The shadows weren't just around me, they were in me, crawling under my skin, whispering things I couldn't understand. My heart raced. The thing in front of me grinned wider, its mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing a darkness that swallowed everything, my thoughts, my breath, my very will. I tried to break free. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything. But I couldn't. I was trapped, bound by the grip of something I couldn't fight, something that didn't care about my fear or my struggle. I could feel it. This was it. This was what I had been pulled into, the thing that had always been waiting, lurking just beyond my reach. The mirror had never been the barrier I thought it was. It was a doorway. A portal. And now, I was standing in the middle of it. The reflection had come to life. And I was becoming part of it. I couldn't breathe. The darkness was suffocating. The air was thick with cold, too cold, as if the very essence of life had been stripped away, leaving nothing but emptiness and the endless whispering of shadows. My body felt heavy, like it no longer belonged to me, as if the world around me was consuming my very essence, pulling me deeper into its unfathomable depths. But I refused to give in. The thing in front of me, the reflection, was getting closer. I could feel it, hear it moving, its presence filling the space, a dark mass that pushed against the air, each step closer sending a wave of dread crashing over me. My mind screamed for a way out, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows closed in, stretching toward me with unnatural speed, like a hungry, never-ending tide. I was being surrounded, my thoughts drowning in the cacophony of whispers that rose, louder, more urgent. "You can't escape," the thing rasped again, its voice a low growl that sent chills down my spine. The words were a promise, and they terrified me. I tried to move, to fight back, but my limbs wouldn't respond. They felt numb, like they were no longer mine. My eyes burned, my throat felt tight, and every breath I took seemed to disappear into the void, as though the air had become a part of the shadow, consuming everything it touched. But then, something shifted. A sudden burst of light. A crack, sharp and loud, splitting through the blackness like lightning through the storm. The reflection, the thing in front of me, paused, its gaze flickering toward the sound. It was a momentary distraction, but it was enough. The walls around me began to shake, and I felt the cold grip on my chest loosen just slightly. I gasped, a small gasp that seemed to be drowned out by the sound of cracking glass. The mirror. The mirror was breaking. I twisted my head toward it, but it was no longer there, no longer reflecting the room. The glass had shattered, fragments of it floating in the air, suspended in space like shattered pieces of reality. The pieces of the mirror didn't fall, didn't shatter, they hung there, glowing faintly in the darkness, spinning slowly around me. I reached out instinctively, desperate to touch one of the shards, to make sense of what was happening. My fingers brushed against one of them, and the instant I did, the darkness flickered. Just for a moment, I saw something, someone, standing on the other side of the broken mirror, staring back at me. Their face was obscured by a blur of shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me. And then, before I could react, the darkness surged forward. A scream tore through my throat, but no sound came out. The shadow, no, the thing, was closer than ever, its form now more distinct, more human in shape, but still far from being anything that could be called real. Its face was like a twisted mask, stretched and contorted beyond recognition, with hollow eyes that burned like coals. My body finally moved, jerkily, against my will, as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. I staggered backward, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness pressed in, folding around me like a suffocating blanket. I slammed into the walls. They felt wrong. Not just the texture, but the very sensation of them. The walls were alive, shifting beneath my touch, breathing in and out like lungs, alive, conscious. The world was twisting again, and I could feel the fabric of reality tearing apart around me. The shadows were no longer just around me, they were inside me. I could hear them, feel them, slithering under my skin, crawling through my veins, their whispers growing louder. But still, I struggled. I clawed at the air, tried to scream, but no sound came. The reflection, the thing, was standing in front of me now, its face impossibly close, its cold breath washing over my skin like ice. I closed my eyes, bracing for what would come next. And then, silence. The shadows faded. The cold, the whispers, the unbearable weight, all of it vanished. I was left standing in a room that looked normal. still, quiet. But the reflection wasn't gone. I could see it in the shards of the broken mirrors scattered around the floor. I could see it in the faint glow of their edges, in the corners of the room where the shadows refused to retreat. It was there, watching, waiting. And it was closer than before. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Had I ever been alone? The door to the room creaked open. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.